Hello, welcome back. I'm Kenny Ortiz. This is KennyOrtiz.com. You are watching part 3 of the series, How the Church Was Started. And it would be an absolute injustice if I didn't spend some time talking about the man who was the largest and greatest catalyst for the growth and the expansion of the church in the first century. The man who planted dozens of churches, wrote most of the books of the New Testament, and of course I'm talking about the Apostle Paul, my hero, and a man who I believe ought to be the hero of most Christians. Paul was really outstanding. He was brilliant, he was strategic, and he was willing to do anything to see the gospel spread. He sacrificed multiple times. He was stoned, left for dead, beaten, shipwrecked, flogged. They would flog people with these whips that had glass and it's very sharp stones, where they would whip people in the back, and the stones and the glass and the sticks would get stuck in the back. So when they pulled the whip back, it would rip flesh. For those of you who've seen the movie The Passion of the Christ, this is how Jesus was flogged. Paul was flogged like this 5 different times in his career. He was beaten multiple times, thrown in prison, wrongly and unjustly multiple times. And eventually was beheaded. He eventually was executed in Rome because he refused to acknowledge the Caesar as God or Caesar as Lord, and he would only acknowledge Jesus as Lord. And so this guy was incredible. And again, it would be an injustice to not spend some time talking about who Paul was. And I really encourage you to go check out, do some research and Googling on the Apostle Paul and his life story. He was born and raised in the eastern portions of what is modern-day Turkey, Asia Minor. His dad was most likely a very wealthy, very powerful, very influential government official. So Paul would have grown up with the best education and would have been used to having power. And he proved to be very, very intelligent. He probably had an IQ that was just off the charts. His writing style and the strategy and the developments that he allowed for his churches to see and the success he saw in his ministry, a large portion was because he was just so intelligent. And the other part of it is because he was just so willing. He exemplifies that anyone who is willing to sacrifice and willing to die and willing to go through anything can be used of God. So, he's raised in this very influential, wealthy family. When he's a teenager, he goes off and he is mentored by a guy named Gamaliel. Gamaliel would have been considered the absolute expert, the greatest rabbi in the first century, in the early part of the first century. He was mentored by that guy. And eventually, Paul is the leader of persecuting Christians. Most of you sure know the story. He's killing Christians, and one day he's going down Damascus Road on the way to murder more Christians, and a beam of light shows up, and Jesus begins to talk to him, and says, "Why are you persecuting me?" And it was at that moment where Paul his life is changed forever, and the entire trajectory of his life is changed forever. You can read about his conversion in Acts 7, 8, and 9. And in the rest of the book of Acts, Paul is really the central figure. He's the central character. And it's talking about his life. He's probably converted. Different theologians have different, all have different timelines exactly. I think he was probably converted right around 37 or 38 AD. Ends up spending some time in Antioch. He gets hooked up with the Christians there. He gets hooked up with a guy named Barnabas. Barnabas is one of the most influential church leaders in the earlier portion of the first century. Was one of the church leaders, on par with Peter and John and James. Barnabas did a lot of great things in the upper portion of Palestine, the eastern portion of Asia Minor, and was working with the Jews. And there's some evidence that maybe some of the Greeks obviously were working with some of those churches as well, along with Barnabas. And so Barnabas sort of probably takes Paul under his wing, sort of mentors Paul in the faith and brings him up. And in 47 AD, they go off on their first missionary journey together. And Barnabas is really the leader of this trip, and Paul sort of his sidekick. And then there's another guy, not want to say sidekick, but they're cohorts, they're partners. But Barnabas is really the main leader. And they bring a guy named John Mark along with him, the guy who wrote the book of Mark. But this John Mark is young and sort of early in his faith. In fact, during this missionary journey, about a third of the way through, John Mark deserts them. He takes off because he was too tough for him, and he ends up hooking up with Peter. Peter ends up mentoring him, and John Mark sort of makes a real strong comeback, which is a great lesson for all of us who have blown it, made mistakes, maybe have quit ministry. That if John Mark can make a comeback and write one of the Gospels, probably the most influential gospel in the first century, then all of us can make a comeback from our failures. And Paul too, Paul was a murderer of Christians. If Paul can make a comeback and end up being the greatest missionary evangelist the world has ever seen, there's no doubt that any one of us can make a comeback from our failures and our flaws and our sins. And so there's great hope, and Paul is great hope for that. So anyway, Paul and Barnabas go off on a missionary journey for 2 years. They end up visiting 10 different cities in the process, mostly just the eastern portion of Asia Minor. They go to the island of Cyprus. They go to this island of Cyprus. They go around. It's a sort of a short journey, 1,400 miles round trip. They go back to Antioch. They're there for a few months. Then Paul goes off on his own. Him and Barnabas end up splitting up, and you can read about that. Acts 15 to 18. Covers that sort of the second missionary journey that Paul goes on, and his sidekick, his mentor, the guy he's mentoring, is a guy named Silas, and so he ends up hooking up with a guy named Timothy as well on this trip, Priscilla and Aquila, and a guy named Luke. They all sort of hook up on this trip, and he ends up visiting multiple cities on this trip. He ends up going to multiple different regions all throughout what is eastern portion of Asia Minor. But then he goes sort of across the top, which was the province of Galatia, which was sort of above modern day, what is sort of modern day today, above Turkey. And he heads back over to what is modern day Eastern Europe, and then he heads back down to what is modern day Greece, and he heads over to Greece. This is the first time the gospel has gone this far, and he hits all kinds of Greeks, and he goes all the way down the Greek coast preaching, and this whole journey. He ends up spending a total of more than 3 years on this missionary journey. He spends 18 months of it, though. He spends just a few weeks in each city. But he gets down to the very bottom of Greece, and he comes to the city of Corinth. He spends 18 months there. And in Corinth, the Corinthians become sort of Paul's baby. Like, he loves them. He loves this church more than any other. This becomes the place where he spends most of his time and effort. Not most of his time, but most of his effort. You can tell his blood, sweat, tears, prayers are in this region. He loves these people. There's no doubt about it. That he has a special affinity for the Corinthian people. The city of Corinth was a port city of an incredibly rich city. Almost everyone there would have been very rich. Landowners and a lot of money in this city, and because it's a port city, a lot of people are stopping in these ports. And Paul's very strategic. He plants this incredible church in Corinth, spends times there, and he uses Corinth as sort of a mini launching pad because people are traveling all over the Roman Empire on ships. They're stopping in Corinth, and they're hearing about this guy named Jesus for the first time. And this is one of the main reasons the gospel ends up spreading, because people are in Corinth and these port city, and they're hearing about the gospel. They're visiting Corinth at port when they're stopping on these ships, and they're going back to wherever they're from, and they're telling people. And so the number of people who would have gone through Corinth in this port city probably was been the second busiest port city in the entire Roman Empire. The only one more busy or more influential might have been the city of Ephesus. And we'll see how Paul is strategic there. So he spends time in Corinth, loves these people, sails over to Ephesus. He's there just a short period of time, but he promises to come back because he also feels the same pull, but he wants to go back to Jerusalem. And so he ends up taking from Ephesus, sails over to Jerusalem, and then it is there where Paul begins to do some other ministries. In the next video, I'm going to talk about Paul again a little more. I'm going to talk about how Paul was strategic in using the city of Ephesus as a launching pad to send the gospel to the rest of the known world, and how that brought had a tremendous influence over how gospel spread throughout the known world in the first century.